The year was 1944. The European sky was a canvas for relentless destruction. In the heart of the collapsing Third Reich, deep beneath the Harz Mountains, lay the sprawling and terrifying network of tunnels known as Mittelwerk, the industrial heart of the V-2 rocket program. But as the Allied advance carved deeper into German territory, the bombing campaign relentlessly targeted every facility even remotely connected to Nazi military power. One such facility, a nondescript and heavily fortified research complex near the town of Nordhausen, had been reduced to a skeletal shell by a precise and punishing raid. The target coordinates were simple: destroy the Messerschmitt experimental workshops. Allied intelligence believed they had successfully crippled a new jet fighter assembly line. What they found in the twisted, smoke-scarred ruins was something far less conventional than a jet, and far more unsettling. The spoils of war, a mechanical anomaly. For the technical intelligence teams, a motley collection of engineers, linguists, and combat veterans, sifting through the wreckage of Hitler's war machine was a macabre yet exhilarating routine. They were the scavengers of secrets, the first to lay hands on the spoils of war: radar systems, guidance devices, prototype tanks, and the increasingly sophisticated jet engines of the Luftwaffe. In a mostly intact sub-level bunker, the team found a sealed, climate-controlled chamber. Inside, resting on a heavy steel gantry, was the object of their eventual and deep confusion. It was not a weapon. It was not a vehicle. It was an engine, but not an engine anyone recognized. It weighed nearly 2 tons, a gleaming matte gray cylinder of complex alloys covered in instrumentation ports and cooling conduits. It looked like a fusion of 3 separate machines forced into a single seamless body. The front section held a sophisticated axial compressor reminiscent of the Me-262's Jumo 004, but drastically enlarged and designed for a much higher compression ratio. The middle was a labyrinth of combustion chambers. The rear was an open, flared tube lined with heat-resistant ceramics and fitted with a massive hinged nozzle, a ramjet shroud intended for extreme speed. Lieutenant Colonel Alistair Thorne, a veteran aerodynamicist from the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough, ran his gloved hand across the casing. The metal was still faintly warm, even weeks after the bombing. "What in God's name is this, Sergeant?" he muttered. The object was immediately registered, crated, and shipped under the highest priority: Project Chimera, German Experimental Propulsion Unit. The analyst's blind spot: dismissal by design. The engine, eventually designated the K-18, arrived not at a weapons range but at a secure facility near Wright Field in Ohio. Allied engineers began the long process of disassembling it. Their first assessment bordered on contempt. Why? Because the late-war German research landscape was saturated with bizarre, impractical projects. The collapsing war effort, driven by Hitler's delusions and Göring's incompetence, had descended into a chaos of miracle weapon fantasies. They had seen crude vertical takeoff, flying disc attempts, rocket interceptors built mostly of wood, ramshackle desperation weapons of every shape and kind. The K-18 was simply placed into this strange gallery of misguided wonders. The chief engineers, men who had spent years perfecting the Rolls-Royce Merlin piston engine and pioneering early jets like the Gloucester Meteor, focused immediately on the K-18's supposed fatal flaws. The materials. The engine consumed enormous quantities of nickel, chromium, and other scarce metals. It was wasteful to the point of absurdity. The theory. The ramjet section required the engine to already be traveling at roughly half the speed of sound, around 380 miles per hour, simply to begin producing thrust. A powerful turbojet section was needed just to reach that speed. The whole idea seemed cripplingly complex. The fuel. Spectrographic analysis showed it required an extremely refined, low-volatility fuel that German industry could barely produce outside laboratory conditions. The verdict was almost unanimous. Another bizarre Nazi experiment. Too complex, too expensive, too theoretical. The K-18 was filed away as a technical curiosity, German over-engineering at its strangest. The misplaced blueprint. A glimmer of sanity. The engine remained a curiosity until a young MIT analyst arrived, Dr. Elias Vance, a mathematician obsessed with the physics of high-speed flight. He was tasked with cataloging the paper archives, a monotonous chore for a mind like his. Yet within those dog-eared papers he found a misfiled schematic tucked inside a maintenance manual for an ordinary Jumo 004. It was a sectional diagram of the K-18. But what mattered was the red ink notation beside it. A performance curve, labeled maximum velocity, indicated a top speed of 1,040 km per hour at 12 km of altitude. Fast for 1944, but just possible. Then Vance's eyes reached a second graph, labeled with the German term for ramjet engagement. It depicted the engine's projected speed after the turbojet transition to ramjet operation. The curve rose sharply, almost vertically. At its peak, the number read 1,550 km per hour, roughly 963 miles per hour, about Mach 1.25, a speed no aircraft on Earth could yet achieve. Vance realized the truth. The K-18 was not designed to reach 1,550 km per hour. It was designed to begin its supersonic phase at that speed. This was not a jet engine. It was a two-stage hybrid, a turbojet wrapped inside a ramjet, built to transition seamlessly from subsonic thrust to supersonic power. It was decades ahead of its time. The mystery introduced. The sound barrier shattered. The senior engineers had dismissed the turbojet section as marginally improved German hardware. They had dismissed the ramjet section as impractical. They had dismissed the entire engine as a waste of resources. What they missed was the integration, the complete, unified design. At low speeds the ramjet was just dead weight, an exhaust shroud. But once pushed to the brink of the sound barrier, the ramjet would ignite, the intakes would reconfigure, and the engine would become a massive supersonic air-breathing rocket. Nothing in the known German aviation program resembled such a system. Nothing in Allied development came close either. Vance wrote in a classified memo. Someone built an engine decades ahead of its era, an engine capable of rewriting aviation, and we have no explanation for how it exists in 1944. By mid-1944 Germany was collapsing. The Soviets crushed the Eastern Front. The Allies landed in Normandy. Cities burned under ceaseless bombardment. Hitler and his high command retreated into a fantasy world of miracle weapons that could turn the tide. The demand for revolutionary technology reached hysterical levels. The V-1, the V-2, the Me-262 jet, the rocket-powered Me-163 Comet. Speed became the obsession. They needed aircraft that could reach Allied bombers before they dropped their payloads. They needed weapons no Allied fighter could catch. Amid this chaos, a small and unusually insulated research team attached to the German Research Institute for Aeronautics began pursuing something unheard of. Not a faster engine, a new kind of engine. A way to make the air itself work for you beyond the speed of sound. The concept was the integrated turbo ramjet powerplant. The wall of impossibility. Metallurgy and heat. The idea of a combined cycle engine was known in theory. In practice, it was impossible in the 1940s. A ramjet running at Mach 1.2 would generate temperatures that would destroy any known alloy. Turbine blades would melt or warp long before the engine reached such speeds. But the search for miracle weapons gave the DVL researchers an unrestricted budget. And they solved the material problem. The K-18 was made of experimental heat-resistant ceramics and exotic superalloys, high-purity nickel, cobalt, molybdenum, manufactured in microscopic batches under extreme secrecy. They could build only one engine like this. But they did build one. The obsession of one engineer. The surviving German documents reference one figure repeatedly, a brilliant, obsessive engineer known only through a cryptonym. His identity remained classified in the Allied archives. His belief was simple: speed is the ultimate power. Speed as defense. Speed as offense. Speed wins wars. He envisioned an aircraft that could break the sound barrier, outrun all pursuit, and attack or vanish at will. A reconnaissance plane immune to interception. A fighter that set the terms of every battle. The K-18 was the key to his vision. Morgenstern was the airframe built around it. The aircraft that should not exist. The internal German records recovered near Nordhausen referred repeatedly to an aircraft designated Morgenstern, the Morning Storm. It appeared nowhere in the Luftwaffe production lists, nowhere in the Messerschmitt or Junkers archives, nowhere in the requisition books of the Armaments Ministry. It existed only in a handful of classified engineering memos, a few damaged blueprints, and in the strange engine that had survived the Allied bombing. Those fragments painted the outline of something astonishing. Morgenstern was not a jet fighter. It was not an interceptor. It was not a bomber. It was an experimental research airframe built for a single purpose: to reach supersonic speed in level flight. Its wings were tiny, sharply swept, barely more than fins, designed not for maneuverability but for stability at extreme velocity. Its fuselage was long and narrow, shaped to reduce drag during transonic acceleration. And at its center, behind an armored firewall, sat the K-18 engine. The German engineers, in their constrained and cautious technical vocabulary, described it as an airframe built for a velocity regime beyond the practical limits of current aeronautical science. In modern language, it was a supersonic aircraft created 20 years before supersonic flight became reality. The missing prototype. Records showed that the Morgenstern airframe was almost complete by early 1944. The wings were finished. The cockpit module was finished. The control surfaces were tested in wind tunnels at the German Research Institute for Aeronautics. But no document ever confirmed final assembly. No flight test logs existed. No photographs survived. The simplest explanation was that the airframe was destroyed in the Allied bombing of the Nordhausen facility. Yet, curiously, the paperwork used the past tense when describing the aircraft. Statements like, "The prototype was fitted, flight preparation had begun, the engine was installed and aligned." These phrases suggested final assembly had taken place. But there was no trace of the completed aircraft. It was as if the airframe had been removed from the facility before the bombing, quietly, secretly, and taken somewhere else. The question that haunted Allied investigators was, did Morgenstern ever fly? At the time, the sound barrier was considered a physical limit. The best Allied aircraft struggled as they approached it. Control surfaces locked, wings shook violently, engines starved for air, aircraft plunged into deadly dives. Pilots called it the compressibility barrier. Engineers called it the transonic region. The public called it the impossible wall. No aircraft in 1944 had ever broken it. And yet someone in Nazi Germany had built an engine specifically designed to operate beyond it. The K-18 could not simply exceed the sound barrier. It was optimized for that regime. It came alive there. The German designers had solved problems the Allies would wrestle with for the next decade. Shockwave control, supersonic airflow management, thermal stress distribution, stage transition between subsonic and supersonic propulsion. The K-18 was not an accident. It was the result of deliberate engineering aimed at a single target. Mach 1.2. How it could have changed the war. A supersonic aircraft in 1944 would have been unstoppable. No Allied fighter could intercept it. No anti-aircraft gun could track it. No bomber formation could defend against it. No radar system could reliably measure or predict its velocity. It could have served as a reconnaissance craft immune to pursuit, a bomber that could strike and vanish, a testbed for weapons far ahead of their time, a psychological weapon proving Germany had surpassed the laws of physics. Even one flight would have forced the Allies to rewrite their understanding of aviation. It would have triggered panic and a scientific race unlike anything before. Yet the war ended with no record of such an aircraft ever taking to the sky. So what happened? After the war, the K-18 engine was stored at Wright Field in a secure vault. Only a handful of engineers and analysts ever saw it. Then, in the early 1950s, it vanished from the public record. Its technical analysis reports were classified for decades. The recovered blueprints were sealed. The wind tunnel documents were archived under a false designation. And the surviving German scientists who worked on the project were quietly absorbed into Operation Paperclip, their wartime research sanitized. Not a single one ever spoke publicly about the K-18 or Morgenstern. This silence was deliberate, the strategic reason to hide it. The United States and the Soviet Union were racing to define the future of aviation. Jet engines, supersonic flight, high-altitude reconnaissance, missile programs. The knowledge extracted from the K-18 project provided a shortcut through years of research. Neither superpower wanted the other to know the extent of what they had found. A captured supersonic engine from 1944, impossible for its era, was not something either side could afford to reveal. If the world knew that Nazi Germany had come within reach of supersonic aviation, even fleetingly, panic would erupt about what other undiscovered technologies the regime had nearly deployed. And so the subject vanished. The documents were buried. The engine was hidden or dismantled. The Morgenstern project was erased. The one surviving piece of the story. The only physical evidence that remains is the strange, warm-to-the-touch engine discovered in the wreckage of Nordhausen, a single prototype, the only one of its kind. No airframe survived. No flight logs were ever recovered. No witnesses ever came forward. But the engine was real. Its measurements were real. Its performance calculations were real. And its purpose was unmistakable. Germany had attempted the impossible, to break the sound barrier before the rest of the world even understood it. Conclusion. The morning storm that never broke. The story of the K-18 engine and the Morgenstern airframe is a story of brilliance, desperation, secrecy, and erasure. It is the story of the aircraft that should not exist, powered by an engine that should not have been possible, conceived by engineers who dared to imagine a world beyond the speed of sound. It is the story of a technological ghost, a whisper of what might have been, a fragment of a future glimpsed too early. And perhaps, somewhere in a forgotten archive or a sealed vault, the truth still waits to be rediscovered. For years, the identity of the K-18's creator remained a mystery. German documents referred to him only through a code, the architect. The Allies assumed this was a project nickname. It was not. In 1998, during the declassification of late-war German research files, a fragment of a personnel list surfaced, badly burned, faintly legible, but revealing a name linked directly to the Morgenstern program. Dr. Heinrich Albrecht Kranz, not a physicist, not a propulsion engineer, not an aerodynamics specialist. Kranz had been an applied mathematician whose early work dealt with shockwave propagation, fluid dynamics, and nonlinear airflow. Before the war he had published groundbreaking but obscure papers on transonic instability, which only a handful of researchers understood. His colleagues described him as brilliant, erratic, secretive, a man who believed that mathematics could solve any physical problem if pushed far enough. The German Research Institute for Aeronautics eventually pulled him into their high-speed research division. From that point on, Kranz disappeared from public life. Officially, he became indispensable to confidential research. Privately, he became the driving force behind the K-18. Kranz's vision, beyond human flight. The surviving fragments of his notes, recovered from a collapsed safe room in 1945, reveal something extraordinary. Kranz did not want a faster aircraft. He wanted a new era of flight. He envisioned machines that could slip through the sky faster than sound, outrunning turbulence, weather, and even the limitations of human reflexes. He saw the sound barrier not as a wall, but as a door. In one of his scribbled phrases, translated years later, "To defeat the enemy, we must defeat the sky itself." Kranz believed that once Germany mastered supersonic flight, everything else would follow. New weapons, new reconnaissance methods, new forms of warfare no other nation could counter. Morgenstern was not a prototype fighter. It was a proof of concept, the first step toward Kranz's grand plan. But the war collapsed faster than his research could mature. And then something strange happened. Witnesses from Nordhausen, mostly forced laborers and guards, later described a mysterious event shortly before the bombing of the complex. They recalled a group of high-ranking officers arriving at night, unmarked trucks entering the facility, the sound of heavy machinery being moved, Kranz himself leaving under escort. One prisoner remembered it vividly. The mountain swallowed something, and the world swallowed him. The Allies never found Kranz's body. He vanished in the final weeks of the war, along with several crates of documents. And crucially, a complete aircraft fuselage was listed as departed by rail 2 days before the bombing. Destination unknown. The mysterious radar track. On a spring night in early 1945, British radar stations along the North Sea coast recorded an anomaly. A fast-moving contact appeared at extremely high altitude. It accelerated rapidly, far beyond the speed of any known aircraft. Then it vanished. The operators dismissed it as equipment failure. Wartime radars were notoriously temperamental. But one technician, interviewed decades later, insisted it was no glitch. "I had never seen a return that clean. It climbed, then it was simply gone." The time and trajectory of the signal matched perfectly with the evacuation from Nordhausen. Was Morgenstern flown to safety? Did Kranz test it himself? Or was it something else? A desperate, one-way escape? The truth remained locked behind classified files for half a century. Operation Paperclip. The silence begins. When the United States began absorbing German scientists after the war, Kranz's name appeared on several lists, only to be crossed out each time. The reason was suspiciously consistent. Background too sensitive. Project involvement classified. Not eligible for transfer. Some historians interpret this as evidence Kranz died during the war. Others believe he was captured and then quietly erased. A minority whisper that he defected elsewhere, to the Soviets, perhaps, or to a remote safehouse where he continued his research. But one fact is certain. The K-18 engine disappeared from public record shortly after Paperclip began. And Morgenstern vanished entirely. The Americans had their reasons. The United States was beginning its own supersonic efforts. The Bell X won the Douglas D-558, the early missile programs, the Cold War reconnaissance initiatives. The K-18's ceramic coatings, high-temperature alloys, bypass channels, and shockwave control methods offered a treasure trove of shortcuts. Revealing the engine's existence would raise uncomfortable questions. How much American post-war research depended on captured German breakthroughs? How far had Germany actually progressed in 1944? What else might have been hidden? Most importantly, if the world learned that the Nazis had nearly broken the sound barrier, it might undermine the triumph of American innovation. And so the truth was buried. Inside was a single curved panel, heat-scarred, ceramic-lined, and bearing a manufacturing stamp matching the Nordhausen workshop. It was unmistakably part of the ramjet shroud of the K-18. Yet the rest of the engine was nowhere to be found. And there was something else. A small steel plate, engraved in German. Vertraulich. Morgenstern 1. Confidential. Morningstorm 1. The number 1 implied something shocking. There was meant to be a 2. Perhaps even a 3. The project had not been a lone experiment. It had been the beginning. If Morgenstern had flown operationally, aviation history would have changed forever. Supersonic flight would have begun not in 1947 with the Bell X-1, but in 1944 under a collapsing regime. Every Cold War aircraft, the U-2, the SR-71, the MiG-25, the F-104, would belong to a lineage that started earlier, stranger, and darker. But history does not remember the nearly triumphant, only the victorious, and so Morgenstern became a ghost, a whisper lost in paperwork, a project too advanced for its era, a machine glimpsed too late to matter, a storm that formed in silence and died unseen. Epilogue. The engine that should not exist. Today, the story survives only in fragments. A warm cylinder of exotic alloys found in a bunker. A blueprint hidden in a manual. A radar track dismissed as a glitch. A missing mathematician. A heat-scarred ramjet panel in a forgotten crate. Piece by piece, the evidence tells a single, haunting truth. In the final months of the war, Nazi Germany built an engine that belonged to the future, and tried to build an aircraft capable of breaking the sky. The world was not ready. History chose to forget, but the Morgenstern project remains a reminder. Sometimes the future arrives early, and the world silently looks the other way.